he's on the horns of a dilemma. It doesn't make him look strong. It doesn't make this country look clever, but it probably panders to the left wing of his political party.
In his news conference at Downing Street a little earlier, Keir Starmer said that Britain was in a heightened state of readiness and was prepared for the conflict in the Middle East.
Throughout January and February, we were moving defensive assets to Cyprus and Qatar. Fighter jets, air defence missiles, advanced radar, and systems to take down drones, to ensure we were in a heightened state of readiness in advance of any conflict beginning. When the strikes began on Saturday, we immediately put those jets into the sky.
So that was Keir Starmer earlier. Let's now talk to the former head of the Army, Lord Dannatt. Hello to you, Richard.
John, good evening.
Hi, Richard. I've got an idea of where your thoughts are on this question of engaging with Iran on the side of America. So let me put, as it were, some contrary arguments to you. What do you say then to those who say, look, it would not have been a good idea to going in full-bloodedly with America at the very earliest stage of this, before the weekend, because the Prime Minister would have exposed himself to being accused of being too hawkish, of following in the footsteps of Tony Blair, and that might have imperiled an important amount of public support and made the job harder. I wonder what you say to that, first of all.
Well, I think the Prime Minister has been and is in a difficult position. I'll take what he said in his press conference earlier on today at face value, that certain precautionary moves were taken by our country to make sure that the base at Akrotiri and the naval base at Bahrain were adequately protected. It does beg the question why now we've got to send a Type 45 destroyer to thicken up those defences. And yes, and he was very conscious that we've all tried to learn lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, and learn lessons that Tony Blair said to George W. Bush right back in Easter 2002, George, we're with you all the way. And I think Keir Starmer has wanted to be more measured as far as that's concerned. But I do think that the decision not to allow the Americans to use the base at Fairford, and presumably the ones in East Anglia as well, and also Diego Garcia in the Chagos Islands, probably took the Americans by surprise and probably rocked our relationship, or Trump's relationship with Keir Starmer, back a bit. Yeah. So I think he has been measured. He is trying to do the right thing. But equally, I can understand the frustration that Trump and Netanyahu are feeling with the UK, who have traditionally been strong allies and let's face it, Iran is not on the side of the angels here. It's been sponsoring Hamas, sponsoring Hezbollah, sponsoring the Houthis, exporting violence around the region. Sending missiles and technology to the Russians as far as Ukraine is concerned. So the case to support the Americans and the Israelis is a pretty strong one. But I think, personally, I feel that he's slightly too much on the side of caution.
Right. You think he should have gone in, as it were, harder and sooner?
It's a very hard distinction to make, to say, well, yes, you can use the bases for defensive operations, but not offensive operations. And I know what Kemi Badenoch was trying to say in the House of Commons yesterday about it not being sufficient just to shoot down the arrows, but we've got to go for the archers as well. And she's making a perfectly reasonable point. I think Keir Starmer is walking a very tightrope. I think he is probably just about getting away with it, but the price is the current temperature of our relationship with Trump. Does that matter? And, well, where do we go from here?
It's also part of the Prime Minister's argument, Richard, as you've seen, that he saw no clear planning behind this operation before it was launched. And I've been discussing on the programme today this reporting and analysis that says that President Trump is really just driving it all on instinct, as opposed to relying on your equivalents, your opposite numbers in the Pentagon, in Washington, or his security advisors. I wonder how you, as a soldier, would be feeling if you were in that position. You were in such a position where you were organising, you were leading operations, while the leader that you were obliged to follow when it came to legal orders was making instinctive and not considered decisions.
Well, I think one has to debate, and of course we don't really know the answer, as just how instinctive this is, or how much of this was putting a plan into action. General David Petraeus has been on the airwaves quite a lot in the last few days, saying that right back in the day when he was head of the CIA, that plans were being made to put pressure onto Iran, and some of the things that he has seen happening that were those things that were being planned back many years ago. Now, what I think is undoubted is that the Israelis, probably through their intelligence, which is pretty good, saw an opportunity early last Saturday morning when the Supreme Leader and many of his senior cohort were in one place at one time, that the temptation to attack at that moment was too great, and they went for it. And on that basis, probably the thing kicked off on an instinctive basis, on an opportunity basis, and that's actually not discreditable, but it's then gone on from there. Now, the big question is, and this will be debated over time, is yes, okay, it started quickly, but how much of the planning had already gone ahead? How much was indeed instinctive? And I think also, if you look at the targeting that's been going on, there was quite a bank of targets that the Israelis and the Americans had built up over time. They also had to be quite careful about securing their own aircraft and their own unmanned systems, getting through the Iranian air defences. So I think just to say this was done instinctively, I think is a bit of a cheap shot. I think it happened because there was an opportunity, but I think it then began to roll out a plan which had been some time in the making.
Well, another point that was deployed by the Prime Minister is that there was no legal clarity. There was a risk that this operation by the Americans in its early stages would have breached international law, and that, he said, could have left our forces exposed to some legal jeopardy. So, as a soldier, as a former commander, how would you address that?
Well, we've agonised over these things for many years, and we've had a bill going through Parliament, the Overseas Operations Bill. Then we've had a Northern Ireland Legacies Troubles Bill, and we've tried to get around this to protect our people against vexatious inquiries after the event. But I think go back to something I said 5 minutes or so ago. Whichever way you look at Iran and its activities, sponsoring Hamas, sponsoring Hezbollah, sponsoring the Houthis, exporting weapons to Russia to attack Ukraine, I don't think it's a too difficult case to make to say that attacking Iran to contain and contain them and prevent these things happening was such a flagrant breach of international law. I think you can make a pretty good case to say this has been some time in the making, and the Iranians had it coming, and now we are where we are, and they are under a lot of pressure. Okay. Right. I mean, they've exported it right across the region for their own reasons, trying to get other governments to put pressure on Washington to stop. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out, but it looks to me as if other governments are pretty fed up with the Iranians, and I think that's backfiring on them.
Right. I mean, you use the word vexatious, Richard. So do you consider that any attempt or plan to try to mobilise international law against a British decision to engage more fully, more quickly, you think that would have been vexatious, that would have been frivolous?
Well, it's really a question of what we're talking about. I mean, I think if the British government had decided it was going to go in with the Americans and the Israelis right from the start, and British armed forces were involved, then the British government then has to stand behind and with soldiers, sailors, airmen and marines who take part in these operations. What is unacceptable, and this is what we've been arguing against for quite some time, is that when individual service people are then investigated and charged with offences which are questionable either in national law or international law, that is what many of us think is wrong. And that's what we've been arguing against for many, many years. So in this case, if the government had decided it was the right thing to do, it should stand behind our service people and not allow them to become individually picked off by human rights lawyers.
Right. Now, you are a consistent advocate for more defence spending, faster defence spending. I mean, you do have to wonder whether this war in Iran might just strengthen the arms of those who want to see a step change in defence spending and the speed of that commitment.
Well, we're going to say, I don't know what other shocks we have to endure before this government, and indeed it could have been a previous government, starts to put money where its words are. It wasn't that long ago that Keir Starmer was at the Munich Security Conference saying, we're going to spend 3% of GDP by the end of this parliament and 3.5% by the end of the next parliament. Well, where is that money? We didn't hear any mention of it in the spring statement. The Ministry of Defence can't let additional contracts to fire up British industry for either equipment or ammunition or missiles without more money going on the table. So the time for words has got to stop, and the time for action, and that means the Chancellor finding more money, reprioritising government spending so that we've got the military capability that can make a significant contribution to the security of this country and the security of Europe. And that's what matters for us, to deter further aggression, particularly from Russia.
Yeah.
The time for action is now. The time for words was yesterday, last month, last year, or even 5 years ago.
Right. Now, earlier I was talking to Sir Anthony Beeper, the renowned military historian. I'm sure you've got his books there behind you in your own home. I put it to him, what did he think of Keir Starmer as a war leader, or maybe an anti-war leader, or a reluctant war leader? He wasn't over-impressed. Are you impressed?
Well, I think go back to what we said at the start of this conversation, John. I mean, I think he's walking a very tight line. He doesn't want to be pilloried by history in the same way that Tony Blair was for too enthusiastically rushing in with George W. Bush into Iraq. But I think, as I said earlier, I think he's been overcautious in denying the Americans the use of bases in Britain and the base in Diego Garcia. And I think it's a very difficult line to tread to say, well, we join in defensive operations, but not offensive operations. So I think he's on the horns of a dilemma. It doesn't make him look strong. It doesn't make this country look clever, but it probably panders to the left wing of his political party.
Yes, and just hearing a moment ago about some new opinion polling, which tells me that there is some significant support for the defensive operation which was authorised by the government. But when it came to the possibility of more offensive operations, well, the public was pretty heavily against it. When I say heavily, it's an understatement. Only 8% of people in this particular opinion poll would have supported that. Now, you will argue, I guess, that those people are not seeing the rounded picture, but that's the sort of opinion poll which will give any government pause for thought.
Yes, and I'm quite sure that in these very poll-sensitive days, he will have been studying those opinion polls very, very carefully, which is why he's acted in the way that you and I are discussing now, and I've been describing. I think it's an uncomfortable place to sit on the fence. He's on the fence with sort of 1 foot hanging over on the we're going to join inside. But when you're on the fence, it's pretty uncomfortable. But he's holding that line. He thinks that's the right thing to do. If he's studying public opinion polls, and they seem to indicate that, then he probably feels justified. But the price, and does it matter, is the quality of our relationship with the United States at the present moment. And of course, that's not helped by the fact that for many years now, the American military, with whom we have good relations, have been shaking their heads and worrying that the British defence capability is not what it was, and we're not the strong European armed forces capability that we have been in the past. And that is it's disappointing, it's embarrassing, and it makes it difficult for us to be a useful ally.
All right, Lord Dannatt, former head of the British Army. Good to have you with us. It always is, Richard. Thank you.